Technology came a long way in the roughly 80 years between the American Civil War and World War II. New weapons like machine guns and tanks fundamentally changed how war was waged. But what impact did this have on the gear used by the average infantryman? Today, I'm wearing a loadout indicative of a US combat infantryman in the later months of World War II, and I'll be going through my equipment to discuss which items changed since the Civil War and which items stood the test of time and were fundamentally the same. I have the World War II uniform covered, but to help demonstrate the Civil War uniform, I'm joined today by Dr. Jared Frederick, history professor and host of the Real History YouTube channel. So let's get right into it and start by breaking down these iconic US uniforms. So Jared, I briefly covered what I'm wearing here today, and I think a lot of my viewers are familiar with my World War II uniform. Tell me a bit about what you're representing today.
What I am wearing here today is a typical infantryman's uniform of the United States Army, specifically the Army of the Potomac, in the latter years of the American Civil War. This is all wool, and what you see is very typical of what a line infantryman would have been wearing as he was facing off with the Confederates in the Army of Northern Virginia.
So why don't we get started? I'll go through some of my uniform and the pieces of equipment that I have here, and then you can briefly cover the Civil War counterpart of these World War II items. So why don't we start with the weapons? So I'm set up here with a US M1 carbine. This was the most common weapon used by the US military during World War II. So the carbine was given to truck drivers, artillerymen, sometimes radio operators, maybe ammo bearers, or even machine gun assistant gunners, people like that who were tasked with things other than just firing towards the enemy. So Jared, tell me a bit about your weapon that you have.
What I have here is an 1861 Springfield rifle. This rifle, though, is pretty much the U.S. Army's equivalent of the M1 Garand during the American Civil War. It is 58 caliber, and that often surprises people, the level of punch and pack that it can unleash. Right. It is a muzzle loader that goes through a 9-step loading and firing process. And if you were truly an excellent marksman in the heat of battle, you could get off one round every 20 seconds. So quite an evolution between 1864 and 1944.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned that's the equivalent of the M1 Garand. So the M1 fired the 30-06 round, which was still quite the potent round. The carbine fires a bit of a smaller round. Did the carbines back then generally fire a smaller round in addition to being a little bit smaller and shorter?
They did. Although it was able to make up for that in the speed that it was able to fire. They were breech loading weapons. And the best known example of that really benefiting U.S. cavalrymen is the first day at the Battle of Gettysburg, where the cavalrymen of General John Buford are able to stave off, at least temporarily, a much superior Confederate force, numerically speaking.
And it's kind of the same thing here. You have a smaller round that you're firing with the M1 carbine, but you have more rounds per magazine, so you can fire a bit more before you have to reload because of that smaller round.
And that's why it was so beloved by your average GI.
Absolutely, it was. In the later months of World War II, a lot of troops were carrying stuff primarily in their pockets and maybe on their pistol belt, but troops were still utilizing packs, even this earlier war pack, which is called the M1928 haversack by collectors today. So I have a haversack here. It's packed pretty lightly because, like I said, troops were primarily living out of their pockets. They might even throw this on a truck or something if they were able to. And troops would often have a thick bedroll with plenty of blankets, maybe even a sleeping bag. Sometimes they'd throw some other things they didn't always need in there, like their raincoat, their overcoat, maybe even their mess tin. And that would pretty much always be carried by truck and not by the soldiers. So the pack, you really didn't need to put that much in there, and the haversack, I think one thing that it really got right was the size. The haversack was a good pack to carry some of your personal items that you couldn't fit in your pocket, maybe some extra pairs of socks, some underwear. So Jared, what type of packs did they use during the Civil War? Was it something similar, maybe something a bit smaller? What were they carrying in them? Tell us a bit about that.
Troops during the American Civil War carried a variety of packs, and I'd say the most common of them is the haversack, which was typically worn on your left side along with your canteen. On your right side would be your cartridge box. There would be no left-handed people in the Army in the 1860s. Because the synchronized way in which you lined up and fired your weapons, everybody had to be in tandem when it came to that 9-step loading and firing process. But in the haversack that you would wear on this side, it's typically your food. It's typically your rations. For a soldier in the American Civil War, that would typically be a few ounces of salt pork that would be issued to you on a daily basis, and also the staple of the Civil War soldier's diet, which is hardtack. That is the equivalent of the World War II soldier Army biscuits.
Yes.
So that's one of the things that don't change too much, and that's poor nutrition in both of the conflicts. They also have a knapsack that they can wear on their backs, which is really kind of similar to this, even though it goes by a slightly different name. You could have socks, shirts, an extra blanket, and personal items rolled up within that. Civil War soldiers also had the equivalent of what World War II soldiers would later call the hobo roll. So a blanket that's just wrapped up, you throw it over your shoulders, and yeah, it's a very informal but easy way of carrying things. So here too, there are some similarities that can be found in how they carried their equipment.
You can also see that I have on my haversack an entrenching tool. If you talk to any World War II veteran who was on the front lines, they'll tell you about how much digging they did. They were digging all the time. Every time they moved to a position, they were digging. And part of the reason for that was avoiding enemy fire, especially enemy artillery fire, which was a major threat. Just putting yourself a bit below ground level would protect you from the shrapnel that was flying around. Did soldiers in the Civil War have any type of entrenching tool?
They did not have many formal entrenching tools. Civil War soldiers really would have loved an e-tool or something along those lines that their grandsons would carry in Europe and the Pacific. But really the best entrenching tool you have is this, and that is your bayonet. The bayonet was the multi-purpose tool. It's kind of like the Swiss Army knife for a soldier in the Union or Confederate armies. And naturally this was used as a weapon. It is a spear-like object that is affixed to the end of your musket, and when there's 1,000 of them coming at you, it is meant to strike fear and intimidation. It is a little bit different than the bayonet or the knife that World War II soldiers would have used, because you'll notice that it has 3 sides on it. And so Civil War soldiers were instructed, if they were to ever lunge this into an enemy combatant, you stab him and then you turn it. And that will create a wound that will be almost impossible to heal or suture. So today I have a US M3 knife, and these would be issued to troops who didn't have an M1 bayonet. That wasn't issued all the time across the board. Sometimes you even see these used by troops who did have a bayonet. It was just an all-purpose fighting and utility knife. So I have one final thing in my haversack here, and that is my mess kit, or meat can as they sometimes called them during World War II. So this particular design here was used for many years. They used this basic design in World War I, and then in World War II they continued to use it with some small changes. It folds out here. You could use it as a frying pan. You can hook the pieces together and hold it through the mess line. So for everything else, oftentimes guys use their canteen cups. So the canteen cup basically goes around your canteen. It's just a small cup with a handle on it. And this was the mess kit that a lot of troops ended up using in the field, even though they were issued a mess kit. This was just smaller, more convenient. And for troops traveling light in combat, when every ounce counted, they wanted to save weight and save space in their pack any way they could. So tell us a little bit about the Civil War equivalent of that. What were soldiers eating off of? Well, Civil War soldiers didn't have to worry about saving space in the same way that World War II soldiers did, because they had much simpler fare in that regard. This is actually an original plate from the Civil War. Some were bigger, they varied depending upon contractor. And this is your equivalent of the canteen cup. And it's just a basic coffee cup that you could loop through the buckle on your haversack, and it would often hang outside. Coffee during the Civil War, much like World War II, it was the lifeblood in keeping them going.
Next, why don't we cover our headgear briefly? So I have a very practical helmet on that will stop, hopefully, some shrapnel from hitting my head. It's not going to stop a bullet from a rifle. It probably wouldn't even really stop a direct hit from a pistol round up close. And on top of my helmet, it's already painted a nice shade of OD green to help it blend in with its environment. It has some cork on it to help it from reflecting light even when it's wet so the enemy can't see it. And then on top of that, I have this helmet net. This is called a shrimp net, and it helps break up the outline of the helmet. I could even stick some leaves and sticks in there to further break up my silhouette. And it was a very practical piece of headgear. Your headgear certainly looks very stylish, but I'm not sure how practical it is. Can you tell me about the hat that you have on?
It is not practical at all. And the hat that I'm wearing is somewhat thought of as the universal symbol of a Civil War soldier, whether it be a kepi or a forage cap. One of the other inherent problems is that it offers you next to no protection from the sun. For many troops, the preferred headgear was something with a brim. Sometimes those were issued with your uniforms. Suffice it to say, not very safe, not very practical, but it is stylish.
All right, so moving on to some of the web gear that I have on. I already covered my haversack, but on my pistol belt here, I have an ammo pouch here. This contains two 30-round magazines for my M1 carbine. I have a first aid kit. Every soldier would have one of these on their belt. And inside of here, I have a Carlisle bandage with sulfa powder that was sprinkled on the wound to disinfect it. And you would also have a packet of wound tablets that you could ingest if you had been hit, again, as an antibiotic. Next to that, I have my canteen and canteen cup inside this cover here. Canteen, of course, carries water. It's just made of steel or aluminum, a very simple design. And then over here, I have a little war trophy. This is a Luger. It was very common for troops to take items like this off of the enemy, especially late in the war. There were a lot of war trophies around as guys were moving into Germany. Stuff like this was everywhere. So Jared, now that I've gone through my web gear here, tell me what you're wearing around your belt.
So over here on my left, I have what was commonly referred to as a bullseye canteen. And so there's indentations in it that look like a bullseye, and that offers some reinforcement. So inevitably when you fall on it, it's not going to be smashed like a soda can. You'll also notice that it is covered in a wool liner, and that is a very practical application because if you are fording a river with the rest of your regiment, you can dunk your entire canteen in the river. That will not only fill up the canteen, but it will get the wool wet, and that will act as a natural refrigerator to help keep your water cold. So they aren't as dumb as we often depict them to be. You'll notice that there is a very conspicuous U.S. belt buckle, and soldiers would joke that that, as well as the Federal Eagle buckle that was on your cartridge box, help make you a fine target and bright shiny things. But right next to that is your cap box. And so you'd have 40 to 60 percussion caps filled with fulminated mercury, and that was used in that 9-step loading and firing process for your weapon, which leads us to the cartridge box. Typically you would have 40 rounds of ammunition, often 58 caliber slugs, like I mentioned a little bit ago, in paper cartridges with 60 grains of black powder. And one of the requirements for being in the U.S. Army is that you needed to have 2 opposing teeth. And that was not merely for dietary purposes, but you needed to be able to tear the paper cartridge, which too is one of the steps in the 9-step process.
Would you say that the equipment loadout used by a U.S. soldier in the Civil War was a bit more standardized than the equipment used by a GI in World War II?
I would say that it was a bit more standardized, and one reason why that is so is because Civil War soldiers don't have the range of weaponry and equipment that their successors did in the 1940s. I mean, think of the wide range of small arms that your typical GI has access to in the ETO in 1944. Your average Civil War soldier, he only has a small range of muskets and rifles to pick from. And so I would say the lack of that sort of diversity when it comes to firepower is what led to the sort of standardization that you speak of.
I don't see any captured Confederate pistols on you, but was it common for soldiers to take any types of war trophies or enemy weapons like that?
Absolutely. Pistols and swords from opposing officers were especially coveted in the same way that a samurai sword in the Pacific was a highly coveted item. One of the biggest honors that you could garner for yourself as a Civil War soldier was capturing an enemy regiment's flag. A flag was everything to a regiment. Not only is it a symbol of your unit cohesion and the very cause for which you are fighting, a regimental flag is also a GPS unit of sorts for a fighting unit. If you see your flag going that way, you better go that way. If you see it falling back, you know that it's high time to hightail it and get out of there. So if you lose your regimental flag, you're ostensibly lost, because you can't always hear the orders of your commanding officers amidst the blare of musketry.
All right, Jared, so we covered the captured pieces we just went over. We talked about the canteens and the canteen cups and their equivalents. We talked about the ammunition differences. But the one thing I didn't hear you mention was the first aid kit, and that was something that was ubiquitous during World War II. That's maybe one of the only pieces of gear that every soldier almost always carried. Was there any type of equivalent to that during the Civil War?
There was no personal first aid kit for troops in the Civil War, and hence why there is a relatively high battlefield fatality rate in comparison to the Second World War.
So now that we covered our equipment, let's move on to talking about the uniforms a little bit. So the uniform jacket that I'm wearing is an M1943 uniform, at least that's what it's called by collectors today. This was a later war pattern uniform. It had some improvements over the uniforms used early in World War II. This new jacket had a ton of large pockets on it that you could store more stuff in. It was a darker color to better blend in with your environment. It was a bit longer to better keep the wind from blowing up your jacket, keep you a bit warmer. Now during World War II, some militaries were still using wool jackets, but the U.S. had mostly moved away from that, at least for most of their combat jackets.
And I suspect they were grateful for it.
Right.
Well.
I also don't see a ton of pockets on your jacket.
No, and that was something that I think hindered Civil War soldiers as well. There's a single pocket on this 4-button blouse, and it's on the inside. It's an inside breast pocket. With your M43 jacket, you can shove ration boxes in your pockets. Civil War soldiers it didn't have that, and so that sort of practicality had not yet emerged. That train of thought had not been incorporated yet, and of course, most obvious, yours is camouflaged much better than mine. This Federal blue style was well into use into the early 20th century, and it really wasn't until Teddy Roosevelt came into office that they started to transition into that earth tone and OD green sort of look. So that implementation and that evolution that Teddy Roosevelt was able to implement, it really comes to full fruition during the First World War, where we have earth-toned uniforms and combat fatalities outweigh disease fatalities. So Teddy Roosevelt likewise deserves a lot of credit for helping to modernize the military, and he learned a lot of that the hard way.
So we covered the jacket. I won't go through everything stuffed into the pockets of my M43 jacket, but let me pull out a couple things and maybe you can cover if there was any type of equivalent. Okay. So the first thing I have here are some grenades. I have a Mark II frag grenade, and I also have a smoke grenade stuffed in my pocket here that could be used for signaling or obstructing you from the enemy's view. Was there any type of grenade or handheld bomb that was used during the Civil War?
There were rudimentary hand grenades used on a very, very limited basis, especially in trench warfare in the later stages of the conflict. And perhaps the most famous of them is the Ketchum hand grenade. But it needed to land right on its nose in order to detonate. And so if it didn't land on the nose, it could fall into the enemy's trench, it wouldn't go off, and ostensibly they could throw it back and perhaps find a better aim.
The next thing I have here is a flashlight. Now, during World War II, this still wouldn't have been standard issue for all troops, but typically, not everyone had a flashlight. They were still in high demand during the war. I take it that Civil War soldiers were not carrying around flashlights, so how did they go about solving that problem of trying to see in the dark?
The best that you were going to do was a candle. And like the one I have, sometimes you could put a candle in a tin case and the reflection of the flame would flicker off of the tin. Most of the time, though, that would be used in camp for letter writing or doing various things in the dark as such. So there's really not an effective means of illumination in the same way that a flashlight is used in the 20th century.
I'll ask one final question about the uniform jacket, and that's that mine has a patch sewed onto it for the 9th Armored Division. Did troops during the Civil War commonly sew patches like that on their jackets?
They did have patches, and the ones typically that you would see on a sleeve would be rank, corporal stripes or sergeant stripes. Perhaps a more frequent patch, equivalent to your 9th Armored patch that you're wearing on your M43, is that they would have corps badge patches, usually sewn onto their chest. And so this is really when we start to see the beginning of military insignias to designate men as part of a specific unit.
Very interesting. Okay, let's move on from the field jacket and talk about the rest of the uniform. So I have a wool shirt on underneath my jacket. This is the standard wool shirt used throughout World War II. And the pants, oftentimes guys would wear wool pants, but sometimes on top of that, they would wear HBT or herringbone twill pants. That just refers to the weave of the fabric, herringbone twill, but these are cotton pants. They're not the wool that we see guys dressed in during the war and that I see you're dressed in here. So how does that compare to kind of what you're wearing?
For Civil War soldiers, it was wool, wool, and more wool. Your socks were wool, your uniform is wool, your vest is wool. You might have a cotton shirt or cotton underwear in some regards, but even my shirt under my jacket here is a heavy flannel wool-like material that was fairly common in the Army of the Potomac. So unfortunately, especially since these guys were often on campaign in the deep South in the United States, I suspect it was quite uncomfortable. But I'll also give a little disclaimer on that point and say that they had been wearing clothes like these every day of their lives. And they were far more accustomed to wearing material like this than what we are in the 21st century.
So now let's move on to talking about footwear. So the boots that I have on, they're made of leather. These are a later war boot. They're called the M1943 combat boot. And these boots were kind of revolutionary because they didn't require gaiters to be worn with them. Gaiters, leggings, spats, whatever you want to call them. Those were the canvas cuffs that soldiers early in World War II, and in some cases throughout the end of the war, wore around their low boots to keep mud and whatever else from getting inside their boots.
So the typical footwear that I am sporting here are known as brogans. And in my mind, there's essentially no big difference between them and rough-out boots, with the big major exception that the bottom of these shoes are leather, whereas the bottom of rough-outs are rubber. That little bit of rubber tread makes a world of difference when it comes to marching and also traction while you're on the hike.
Okay, one final item that we can highlight today, and that is my dog tags that I have around my neck here. So these tags, in my case, they have my name, my serial number, some information like my blood type and my next of kin, so they know what to do with me if I get wounded or killed. And I also have a little P38 can opener on here to help open some of my rations and any canned food that I might eat. These were metal, so they didn't easily degrade. If I was buried in the mud and they dug me up later, they'd find this around me. Was there any type of equivalent of that used during the Civil War?
Unfortunately, there wasn't a standardized system during the Civil War like we see with dog tags later on in the 1940s. However, soldiers could private purchase identification tags that they could either have within their personal effects or they could sew within their uniforms. And that typically included 2 or 3 lines where they could put their name, their hometown, and their regiment. And there are accounts of when soldiers were feeling particularly ominous about a battle that was on the horizon, a lot of them would set to start sewing their names inside their jackets. And unfortunately, in some instances, that action turned prophetic.
Jared, I had a great time going through our kits together.
Me too.
If people want to see more from you, where can they do that?
You can follow the link below, and you can follow me on Reel History, R-E-E-L, as in a film reel, where I analyze history versus Hollywood from this set right here. And we analyze Civil War movies, World War II movies, and everything in between. So if you're a movie buff, I don't think you'll be disappointed.
Yes, and thank you for coming on today. Thank you for letting us use your wonderful set here. And a big shout out to your brother Mark, who's behind the camera. He's the reason why we look so good here. It's a hard job to make me look good. He's really kidding. Thanks so much for watching. Keep your black powder dry, and I'll see you in the next one.
And stay curious, my friends.